So quickly, just a little bit about myself and Tag Inspector. So this webinar today is brought to you by Tag Inspector. Tag Inspector is a tag auditing and monitoring platform used and leveraged across thousands of websites globally in order to give our partner organizations insights into what tags or platforms are loading, what data is being collected, how it's being used, and then really facilitates a lot of the governance activities that we're going to be touching on here today. Myself, I'm Lucas. I'm our product manager for Tag Inspector, and then also work with many Fortune 500 companies on development of these different tag governance programs. Quick call outs, just a general disclaimer. We are going to be talking a little bit about the compliance and privacy portion of tag governance and data governance. So while we'll mention some of these different laws and regulations, as always, just keep in mind, this is not meant to be legal counsel. Anything that we talk about with reference to those different privacy, compliance, laws, regulations, we're wanting to give you some guidance and have this be educational, but ultimately before you make any decisions for your organization, you need to consult with your own legal resources in order to be able to ensure that those policies and everything fit what your requirements are. Perfect. So now that we're through that, just kind of a heads up as to how we're going to be walking through this and what our agenda looks like here today. So at first, I'm going to introduce a couple of frameworks and methodologies that we'll be working within. So one of those is going to be the 6 Ps, which really defines the different components that you're going to want to focus on when going through any digital transformation type of activity, including going through any type of tag governance or data governance processes. The second piece, we're going to be just going through tag governance in general. So what is it? What are the different components? What matters? And what to really focus on when you're thinking about tag governance, data governance programs for your organization. Thirdly, we'll go through the how. So those people, platforms, processes that you're going to want to consider and how to think about those different components. And then finally, we'll go through some practical actions and specific next steps. So hopefully can take some really practical takeaways here from the discussion, know exactly what you need to do next in order to get your organization to a place where you have a really solid governance program in place. Finally, we'll wrap up with some Q&A. As always, I like these to be as conversational as possible. So we're using the Zoom webinar platform. There is a Q&A option, so you can hop into that Q&A. Please feel free, shoot questions in there. They're within the Q&A section just as we're going through this. I have that pane kind of up here. So any questions that come in, if it's relevant to and really specific to the topic that we're in, I'm more than happy to dig into some of those different components a little bit more. So definitely ask questions as we go through. Anything that's left over, I will get to at the end. Cool. So to really dive in here, a couple of the different methodologies that we're going to be working within and what I'm going to be referencing throughout so that we're all on the same page. The first one is the 6 Ps of digital transformation. So those 6 Ps, as we have defined them, are first, purpose. So defining what the purpose is. What is the goal? What is it that your organization is trying to accomplish? And when we're talking about digital transformation, or in this case, governance, we're talking about what are the goals, what are the KPIs of your organization. From there, we then can start thinking about the next 3 phases. So the people, the platforms, and the processes that need to be in place in order to make that purpose a reality, or make those different goals a reality, or hit those different targets that you're setting out for yourself. So that's what we're really going to focus on here today. Those people, platforms, and processes as it relates to tag governance and as it relates to data governance. The final 2 components of these 6 Ps are the pace. So how quickly and what is the timeline for working through all of these different items, which is going to depend some based upon just prioritization within the organization as well as resources. And then finally, payoff. So what is the ROI that you're going to be looking at as an organization for going through these different transformation or these different efforts? Ultimately, the payoff when it comes to data governance and tag governance, more specifically, is going to be one, reduction of risk, and risk when we're talking about both privacy as well as compliance, making sure that your organization is not on the hook for most directly fines and lawsuits that could be levied against it, but also more indirectly, making sure that that brand equity and the belief and the faith that your consumers have in your brand is not being tarnished by potentially privacy concerns, as well as a reduction of risk when it comes to performance. So maintaining and improving user experience, and then the ROI also that relates to just having the most comprehensive data set as possible from a first-party data collection perspective, because you have a really good architecture in place, and then really leveraging that in order to be able to drive different marketing and business initiatives. So as mentioned, we're going to be really focusing on the three different levers of execution that you have here. So the people, the platforms, and the processes, and thinking about those in the context of governance is really where we're going to be digging in here today. When we talk about the people, the platforms, and the processes, so the people, what we're talking about for governance is the team that's necessary to accomplish those different organizational goals, or be able to reach that purpose that you have laid out. We're really talking about a cross-functional team when we're referring to tag governance. We'll get into those different components in much more detail. For the platforms, we're talking about the advertising and marketing technology platforms that are in use at your organization. So it's really important to begin with that purpose or the business objective. What that business objective is and what those KPIs are really going to dictate what platforms need to be in use, how you're using those platforms, which then cascades down into that overall data strategy, as well as your compliance and privacy practices, and even that performance. So how you have architected everything in order to be able to minimize any types of risk on user experience issues. One thing I have in here, and just an important note, be honest with yourself about resources and priorities. Oftentimes, a lot of organizations will get into, and this is just kind of broadly, we want everything when it comes to data and analytics. It's difficult to have everything when you don't have a huge team, when you don't have certain key components even within the team. So that really translates to and really speaks to that platforms piece, because it doesn't make sense to invest in a whole bunch of different platforms and a whole bunch of different initiatives when those resources just aren't there. And then finally, we'll really dig into the process. So the ways in which we sustain effectiveness. It's great to have everything be compliant on day one of a new regulation going live. It's great to have all of our data collection architecture be really clean when we first take our website live, or when we first do a redesign of a particular section of that site. Processes are the things that you're going to ensure our ongoing success and are really critical for the organization in order to be able to maintain any kinds of improvements or maintain any kinds of competitive advantages that we are able to really pull out as a result of having good governance in place. Finally, the last kind of framework or methodology that we'll be focusing on, you'll hear me mention here, is just crawl, walk, run. This is what I'm really talking about when it comes to resources and when it comes to being honest with yourself within the organization of kind of what stage you are in. So when we think about that crawl stage, or where we're really starting, we're thinking about the digital architecture and the data governance. If you don't have a solid data collection architecture in place, if you're not doing compliant data collection, it's impossible to get to that next stage of walking and then finally of running. So it's super important, focus on the foundation, which is really what we're digging into here today. Get to that foundation solid so that you have a really good base to be able to build all that cool stuff on top of. When we're talking about walking, we're talking about platform integrations and business insights. So getting into a little bit more advanced analysis, combination of data from many different data sources, which again relates back, if our foundation is really solid, if we have uniform data, if we have consistency in the data structure and the information that's being collected across different platforms, and again, if it's compliant all the way through end to end, that allows us and opens up many opportunities for integration and makes it a whole lot easier when we're starting to want to do some of these more advanced activities downstream. Finally, when we're talking about running, we're talking about forecasting and data science. So really moving beyond just analysis of what is happening right now and what has happened in the past to more predictive analytics as to what's going to happen in the future, and some really cool automation that can go along with that. So those are the frameworks and methodologies that we're really working within. The second part that I really want to dig into here is tag governance. What are we talking about when it comes to governance? You hear from a lot of different organizations, you hear from a lot of people, especially within the tag auditing space, them throwing around that word, tag governance, data governance. And oftentimes we're speaking about completely different things. So when at Tag Inspector and at InfoTrust, when we're talking about tag governance, we're talking about one core goal, and the mission and all the different things really pull off of this. So we're talking about the goal of ensuring complete and compliant data collection in the most efficient way possible in order to be able to drive business decisions. So what this really breaks down to is three components, three really key components that you need to be aware of and that you need to be focusing on when we're focusing on governance. And again, it's holistic across all three of these. Again, when a lot of people are talking about governance, they're just talking about that data collection piece and making sure that you're collecting complete and accurate information. Complete and accurate information collection means nothing if that's not compliant, if we're not legally collecting this information and we're not legally able to actually process and then take action on that information. It also means nothing if we're collecting all the data in the world, but our users are not able to effectively use our different digital properties and our different digital assets. And that's where that performance and user experience piece comes in. So these three components combined together, privacy and compliance. So making sure that we're respecting regulatory requirements, privacy laws, cookie laws, technical restrictions, the things that I like to call kind of the rules of the game when working with many different organizations, as well as the data collection architecture. So there is an importance on that complete and accurate data collection, making sure that we really understand and have visibility into the data requirements for each different platform, making sure that our tag deployment and implementation, we're actually collecting all of those different data points as required by those requirements for different platforms and for our different marketing activities. And then finally, having a central data collection architecture in order to be able to enable those integration activities and downstream activities around advanced analysis that I referred to earlier. Finally, none of this means anything if we can't maintain and improve performance and really optimize user experience. So making sure that those platforms that you have in place and your implementation of tags is not hindering page performance. It's not hindering load times and speeds of your website, and really balancing the business value that you're receiving from these different platforms and the functionality that they provide against the risks that they introduce as a result of just being implemented, having to load and function and run within a user's browser and on your website. So those are the three core components. Now, to dig into each of these components a little bit more. So when we're talking about the first one, that's really critical, probably argue the most critical, is around privacy and compliance. Again, as mentioned, oftentimes I refer to these as the rules of the game. So what are we talking about when we're talking about privacy and compliance? The big ones that we are focusing on and that everyone's really gearing up for, and really the guidelines when we combine these different pieces together that get us in a place where we can then make slight modifications for some of the other laws and regulations, are these that we're looking at here. So the first one is the California Consumer Privacy Act. So anyone that's doing business in the United States, specifically if they have users and clients and customers located in the state of California, if you meet a few different eligibility requirements in terms of the size and scope of your organization, revenue, and then the number of users, this is going to apply. Now, the CCPA is also important because a lot of other US regulations are being modeled after it. So other states are beginning to introduce their own privacy legislations similar to CCPA. Ultimately, it's believed that at some point at the federal level, we'll try to codify a lot of these different things. CCPA being the first in the states really becomes a template, basically, that a lot of states and regulators are beginning to use. So it's really important that's now in effect as well as enforceable. So it's important to know and be following those standards as outlined within the CCPA. For anyone doing business in Europe, you're likely extremely familiar with those lovely letters of GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. In addition to that, also the e-privacy directives or the cookie laws that are in place in Europe today. So some different requirements there was with respect to cookies and the consent to the placement and accessing of cookies within those e-privacy directives. And then on top of these laws, we're also beginning to see, in response to consumer demands, technology initiatives being introduced by browsers themselves. So Apple, you have the ITP initiative, which is the most wide-reaching, restricting the use of third-party cookies, basically making them ineffective, as well as putting additional limits even on first-party cookies that are set via JavaScript in a user's browser. Mozilla has, and Firefox has similar safeguards and similar restrictions and initiatives that they have rolled out. And then also Google Chrome, as many of you are likely aware, announced at the beginning of this year their intent to phase out cookies within the next 2 years. So a lot of technology initiatives being introduced by the actual software and by the hardware that users are using, also with the privacy focus. Above and beyond these, there's different industry-specific laws and regulations. Different countries are introducing their own laws and regulations. For example, in the middle of August, we have Brazil with additional laws and regulations and restrictions going into place there. So understand these rules of the game, understand what exactly each of these things requires, combining that with the foundational knowledge that you need to have of what data is being collected on your sites, by what platforms, how is it being used. All of those things need to be combined together in order to make sure that we are practicing compliant data collection activities. Quickly, just to summarize some of those requirements and the things that you would need to be keeping in mind. So all of these different privacy initiatives, they speak to slightly different things and they have slightly different requirements, but typically everything falls into these broad categories. So first, we're talking about privacy by design. So intent required by privacy considerations. So be intentful and keep privacy and user privacy in mind when we're designing any of our data collection architecture. For specific requirements, we're looking more at transparency and disclosure. So making sure that users are aware and notified as to what information is being collected, by whom, how is it being used, where is it being shared, those types of things. And then making sure that that disclosure is reflected along with a announcing basically of the user's rights within privacy notices and privacy policies. The other area around compliance is typically around access rights. So direct requests from users for access, for visibility into what information that you have collected about them, as well as concepts around data portability. So we're wanting to make sure that we understand what platforms, again, are collecting that personal information, and then making sure that we have mechanisms in place in order to be able to pull those different data points out and provide them back to users on those access and deletion requests. And then finally, requirements around the refusal or the objection of processing. So the specifics for these are going to depend, again, on what regulations are applicable for your business. But for GDPR, we're talking about the refusal or objection of all processing activities. CCPA, the refusal of the sale of personal information. Those technical limitations that I mentioned with the ITP initiatives and with the browser initiatives, and then consent requirements, specifically around the placement and usage of cookies, requiring that affirmative, explicit consent for many of those different e-privacy directives across Europe. So these are the high-level requirements. There's a number of resources that you can check out on the Tag Inspector website, past webinars that we've done, where we really deep dive into these different requirements with respect to each of these privacy laws and regulations and what it means for tag governance. The next component, the next tenet of governance that we're referring to here and what makes this up is that data collection architecture. So the first piece of that, making sure that you have complete and accurate data collection across your different digital properties. And this really refers to and touches on implementation, touches on auditing, making sure that everything is implemented properly and still is running properly based upon those different requirements, as well as putting some mechanisms in place for ongoing monitoring of the data that's being passed by tags, making sure that the proper information is always being collected on those different actions, especially critical interactions with your different web properties. When we think about this, we need to really understand the data requirements for each platform. So understand the business use cases, how are different platforms being leveraged, what are the goals of those different tools, and then understanding what is the configuration of the implementation requirements, data requirements, in order to be able to drive those activities. This also relates to tag deployment and management. So your tagging architecture, making sure that, again, you're collecting uniform data, you're collecting that for all the different users and on all those different actions that are laid out in your requirements. And then how you're leveraging and managing a tag management system in order to be able to support those activities. The final piece that we'll really look at and that you want to focus on as it relates to data collection architecture is that having a central data collection architecture. So a central data object or a data layer that all of the different tags, all the different platforms are referencing for their information. One place to reference keeps everything lean, and it ensures that you have uniform and accurate information, which is what really opens the door for those integration and more advanced activities that you start getting into once you move beyond that crawl and into that more walk and even the run stage. Finally, the third component of governance that we really focus on is around performance and user experience. So tags and their impact on page performance. This is a topic that's been coming up much more recently. Everyone wants to point to tags because people don't really have a whole lot of understanding of what tags are, how exactly they're working. And so they're that kind of unknown thing over there that we can point to and say, hey, those are the things that are causing our page performance issues. In many cases, just to kind of debunk that myth, in many cases, tags are not really having a noticeable, perceivable impact on page performance and user experience. A couple of the metrics that matter, and there's, again, a number of resources on the Tag Inspector website that you can consult for more information on this, but size and request volume matters. So just really keeping control of the overall tagging architecture, cutting down on piggybacking, and making sure that you're only running and only loading the platforms that are really necessary to accomplish your marketing advertising goals, instead of just having every single tool under the moon loading across your different site. But it's important to be able to really quantify that impact of tags, have that visibility to be able to say, and that defensible position also when your operations team comes to you, to be able to say, no, tags in fact are not impacting the performance and that perceived timing of the website. And then also balancing any of those different risks that are there, and balancing any of those risks that are introduced by the addition of tags with the business value for that is associated with those different platforms. So those three main components that we're talking about when we're talking about tag governance. So again, privacy and compliance, making sure that we are collecting compliant and legal data to be able to use. Data collection architecture, making sure that we have complete data and we have everything that is going to be able to take us to that next level when it comes to marketing and advertising and the different initiatives. And then finally, making sure that that overall architecture that we've put in place for complete and compliant data is running as efficiently as possible, not impacting user experience and performance. So really quickly, I want to throw a poll up here before we move into the how and the nitty gritty. So we've talked about those three different components. I'm curious from the audience, of those different main components of tag governance, which do you think your organization currently handles really well? You can select multiple. So if you think you're, or all, so if you think you're doing a wonderful job in all of these different areas, I'm interested in kind of getting an idea of what people are, I guess, handling well and maybe struggling with. Give you another couple of seconds. Cool. Okay. So it looks like, as far as what organizations believe they're doing well, privacy and compliance, a decent number of folks on the call or on the webinar believe that that is an area that they're doing pretty well right now in. Data collection architecture also, and then someone out there thinks we're doing a great job across the board. So that is awesome, and your organization is in an enviable place from the perspective of many others. Cool. So good to know. So now that we, again, have gone through those, the different tenets and those core components of tag governance, now I want to get into the how. So some of those specifics around the people, platforms, and processes, and what we need to be thinking about in relation to each of those different areas within that framework in order to be able to make sure and really build out our overall tag governance and data governance program. So first, when we're talking about those different components, the first aspect we're talking about is the people. And I get asked this all the time. What does our team need to look like for governance? A lot of the information really sits in different areas, as well as the requirements and the really goals for all of this entire program sit with, and different people within the organization, different teams are responsible for different parts. So it requires a cross-functional team. It starts with the business or with marketing, defining what are the goals. What are we trying to accomplish here? From there, it gets cascaded really down. So once the business sets their goals and the overall vision of the organization, media teams are then become involved. So how do we attract the right people at the right time to our different digital platforms through media, advertising? In order to do that, it requires two really big components. One is understanding who are our users, so who are high value customers. In order to do that, we need to collect first-party data across our websites. That's where media teams are involved, but also analytics is involved. And then we also need to understand what are the different activities that we're doing that are having the most positive impact and really moving the business forward. Again, that's where we need to collect information on our sites, on our properties around the effectiveness. Again, media teams as well as analytics teams. Media also is defining the audiences, or who is it to target. You can get a lot of really great information to inform those decisions and even create those audiences using that data that's collected across our websites. So media teams, analytics teams, they all have a say. And there's also, based upon the kind of restrictions and requirements that are put in place around governance, they also have an impact on these different teams. Finally, we have legal, who is going to be responsible for making sure that the organization is following those different privacy and compliance requirements, those regulatory requirements. And while legal has a really good understanding of what's allowed and what's not allowed, oftentimes they do not have that practical knowledge to be able to associate with how this stuff works. So legal can tell me that your legal basis for consent for the collection or the processing of any personal data within the EU has to be consent. That's your legal basis for processing consent. It requires affirmative, explicit consent before you can do any of these different activities. What legal does not understand is the technical mechanism via which those activities happen. So how the tags are responsible for that data collection, and how those tags, by not being able to collect XYZ data points, also means that I'm not going to be able to collect or do ABC activities. So because of how these different decisions and these different areas play together, that's where that cross-functional team comes in. Finally, development operations are going to be involved because they're the ones responsible for actually implementing these things. Then also they're the ones responsible for the performance and that user experience in terms of load times on the website. So we need knowledge and we need guidance as well as feedback from all of these different areas. So it requires representatives with insights into and with their hands in all of these different jars. That said, it is ideal to have a central owner of tag governance. And we're beginning to see this much more frequently, especially at really large organizations. It is really important to have someone be the owner, have it be a big portion or all of their job, basically, to keep control of and facilitate the decisions and facilitate the actions and activities that relate to tag governance, relate to data governance. There's also, when it comes to people, especially when we're talking about tag management, and we get into who's actually using some of this information that's being collected across our digital properties, third-party partners. For media, we might be working with different media agencies. We might even outsource for development the actual implementation and the management of that data collection architecture. We have a lot of third parties that can be involved in this process. It's really important to have internal ownership and internal relationships and be able to tie that to those different third parties that are in play, have that accountability in place, and then have structure and processes around control to be able to make sure that your organization is, in fact, always collecting that complete and compliant data, and that the overall architecture is operating in that most efficient as well as compliant way. It's when you lose sight of and lose control of these different areas is where a ton of additional unnecessary risk is introduced. And that is where ultimately your organization or your company is the one that's going to be liable for any of those ill effects. The second piece that we're talking about here is around platforms. So again, when we're talking about platforms, we're talking about any of the tools that are in use for marketing and advertising. So this includes any source of data collection or functionality that's being leveraged, all the way through the entire life cycle or the entire chain of custody, if you will, for any data that's being collected and leveraged. So it's really important to undergo a business assessment of platforms that are tied to that purpose and the priorities. So again, business, outlines what our KPIs are, outlines what it is that we're focusing on. These individual teams, your marketing teams, your analytics teams, media, are going to be the ones that are then defining what are the tools or what are the platforms that we're going to use in order to be able to advance those efforts forward. We need to have a business assessment and make sure that all of those tools and those platforms that are in use are in fact necessary. And we need to have a really good understanding of how exactly those platforms are operating, what the impact is on the user, what the impact is on our business, and be able to document those different items, because it becomes extremely important when we're talking about policy definition, disclosure for compliance and privacy, and then also making sure that we're keeping our overall architecture really lean and making it as efficient as possible. From a platform's perspective, when we're looking at compliance and privacy, this is where we need to move beyond just those business assessments, but also into more granular data assessments. So assessments asking specific questions relative to the data that's being collected by each platform to make sure that the platform itself and how we are leveraging it is compliant with things like GDPR, CCPA, and e-privacy. Oftentimes, there are going to be additional requirements for, and especially now, just structure and actions that you're going to need to have in place in order to make sure that your use of platforms falls under those different requirements of those different regulations. Once you have all that information, once you've been able to go through and document those different items, that's where your overall data governance policy definition comes in. You need to be able to define in that policy, what are the platforms that are allowed? What are the platforms that are not allowed? What information and what processing activities are approved for each of those allowed platforms? And then some different processes in place in order to be able to ensure ongoing management, which we'll talk about here in a moment. For data collection architecture, through that lens of the platforms, we need to make sure that we understand and we have assessed the data needs of each of these different tools. So we defined the purpose, we defined the platforms that we're going to be using. Now, what are the different aspects and what are the different data points that we need to feed into those different platforms in order to be able to properly use and get the most out of each of these different tools? One component of that, beyond just the assessment itself and understanding the needs of each platform, is translating those needs into that central data object or your data layer architecture, making sure that key data points, key components are included within that. And then translating that also then back up to your overall tag architecture, making sure that you are properly implementing and properly managing all those different tags themselves in order to be able to reference that data object and then properly collect that information. And then finally, through that lens of performance for the platforms that are in use, it's again important to really quantify the performance impact of platforms that are in use. And then once you have that quantified, so once we can say that these are the 3 platforms that are actually introducing a noticeable risk when it comes to the user experience, weighing what is the value that we're getting from these tools, how critical are they versus the risk that they're introducing, making sure that that balance always trends towards both the user experience being optimized as well as the business outcomes being optimized there. The final piece here within those 3 different Ps, so we talked about the people, we talked about the platforms, now in terms of the process. So these are the things that we need to be putting in place in order to ensure sustainability within our tag governance and data governance programs. So we're talking about the structure and processes to ensure those sustainable practices. It's important to have these policies and processes clearly defined. So what are the policies? What are the processes as it relates to each of these different components of tag governance? First one, within compliance and privacy, there's 3 core parts and 3 core processes that you really need to define as your organization. The first one is a process for new platform review and approval. So any new vendor that you're adding to your website, it's really important to go through a full assessment, understanding what information is being collected, how is it being processed, is it being shared, is it being sold, answering all of those different questions. At that point, and only after we have answered all those questions and only after we have documented all of that, should we be approving that as an approved platform to be able to be included on any of our digital properties. This is critical for 2 purposes, really. The first one around compliance and privacy, making sure that we have all the information that we need to inform disclosures, to understand the architecture that needs to be in place for access and deletion, and then also making sure that we understand any implications for opt-outs or even affirmative opt-in and consent. But then also to understand what are the data requirements. So how do we need to build out that architecture? The second one here is policies or processes around any new tag instance that needs to be implemented. So we've approved the platform, say Google Ads or DoubleClick, their display platform. Now we have different instances. So individual unique accounts or individual unique activities that need to be introduced. Making sure that there's a process in place to always go through and remove anything that's unnecessary, and making sure that we're only adding in tags or individual instances of the JavaScript associated with those different tags and those platforms only when necessary. Keep that architecture lean, reduce any kinds of compliance, potential compliance concerns, as well as reduce risk of performance concerns as well. Finally, to make sure that all of these different aspects are being followed and are following what is laid out within the policies, making sure that you have some sort of ongoing monitoring and review process that is in place. So make sure that the requirements that you have outlined are being respected and being alerted whenever anything is broken or is no longer following your requirements. Process also is important when it comes to data collection architecture. So as mentioned before, making sure that you're doing that full data mapping and the implementation. So making sure that implementations of tags is correct, making sure that each platform is collecting all of the necessary data, so complete data collection, and making sure that you are collecting that in the most efficient way possible from a central data object. This has downstream effects. So for reporting and dashboarding, making sure that there is a process and some kind of standards in place for the different consumption ways that you're going about actually consuming that information. So different teams have that access. And then also making sure that processes are in place and having that solid data collection architecture is going to provide that foundation for integration and the advanced analysis like we talked about before. Finally, when we're talking about performance and the processes that need to be involved for performance, it really comes down to, again, that monitoring. So making sure that we are monitoring any changes in website performance over time, especially as we're introducing new platforms or new instances of tags and platforms on our different digital properties. And then making sure that we're keeping that overall tag architecture and data collection architecture lean to be able to reduce the risk of any of those performance concerns. So those are the hows. Those are the people, the platforms, the processes that are necessary for any type of a tag governance or a data governance program. Now I want to take some of those concepts and take what we've talked about here and kind of translate that into what are the practical actions and the next steps that you should be taking at your organization in order to make sure put tag governance, data governance in practice. So we talked about before, our goal when we're talking about tag governance is ensuring complete and compliant data collection in the most efficient way possible in order to be able to drive those business decisions. Step one, and this is where the jump off point really comes in before we can address any of the different actions that are going to be necessary, is understanding what the current landscape is. So when we're talking about understanding the current landscape, we're really talking about a data governance audit. And I'll go through the different steps, at least as we walk through them and as we walk through these with a lot of our partner organizations. So you want to start high level, and then you want to get more low level, and then you want to have considerations for each of those three components of tag governance. So first, it's really important just to get an inventory of all the platforms in use. If we don't understand what platforms are loading, what tags are implemented, then we can't answer any questions that are necessary about, well, is personal data or personal information being collected for regulatory concerns? What cookies are being set? How are those things being used? We can't answer any of those questions necessary to ensure compliant data collection if we have any blind spots or gaps in our knowledge of the platforms that are in use. So it starts with an inventory. This is where a platform like Tag Inspector or a tag auditing platform really comes in to be able to give you that visibility. What are the platforms that are loading? How are they being loaded? Where are they being loaded? And then what data is being collected? How we typically go about this is we'll run scans using Tag Inspector. We'll aggregate that information together in just one central, easy to consume place. So this is an example of an inventory. Just put into spreadsheet format, listing there at the front, the tag name. So what are the platforms that are in place? A little bit of meta information, metadata, category, subcategory of each of those platforms, how exactly it's being loaded, what is the prevalence or what does the coverage look like of that platform across this particular website. But this gives us just that high level look at what are the platforms that are in place. Now, building from that inventory, and after we have gained that insight, we then need to do a business evaluation of the platforms that are being used. So when we're talking about a business evaluation, it's pretty straightforward. We want to answer the questions, how is this platform helping us to address or move forward those different business goals and business initiatives that we have defined from marketing, from overall strategic vision. So we need to identify for each of the platforms that we have loaded or that are included in our inventory, who is the business owner, what is the purpose and the use case for why this platform is implemented and running on our digital assets. Are there any agency partners or third parties that are maybe have ownership of this tool or are also using the information or the data that's being collected there? And then do we have all the documentation in place? So we can expand on our inventory in order to be able to do this, fill in those blanks just around business uses of the different platforms. From here, we can immediately begin to say, okay, this platform we're not using anymore. This one we used for a past initiative, we don't need it anymore. Typically, after just going through this business evaluation, organizations that we work with are able to remove up to 20 to 25% of the platforms that are loading across their different websites. So immediately reducing the scope of the work that you're going to need to be doing to make sure and ensuring compliance, and then also making that overall data collection architecture a little bit more lean. Following that business evaluation of platforms, we then want to get into evaluations and analysis for those specific tenants or components of governance. First one is a privacy and compliance evaluation. Here, I'm just going to very quickly go through, this is a GDPR example. But for compliance and privacy, what's important to understand is first, what are the regulations that are going to, that you need to be playing by? So what are the rules of the game? And then for those, what are the different requirements? And then begin asking questions of your data and asking questions of your architecture that speak to and are going to answer, get you the answers that you need in order to meet the different requirements of those regulations. For GDPR, you can see them here, what data is collected, is any of that personal data, how is it being used, legal-based processing. If we answer these questions and we document it out, which we can do, and we often do in this type of a format. So going through, taking the actual tag data or the values and the information that's being collected, again, visibility given by a tag monitoring platform like Tag Inspector, we can then answer those questions. The answers to those questions are what informs our notification and disclosures to users, and also informs the actions that we need to take around consent, around opt-out, around access, all of that. It starts with this foundation of understanding what all is there and then what are the implications. That again can be rolled up into a platform level analysis so we can understand what are the platforms and what are the impacts on each of those from a privacy standpoint. Moving beyond that, that's going to allow us to define these are the things that are allowed and make sure that we have that compliant data collection and compliant architecture. It's then important to go through, and once we know what's compliant, what we're allowed to do, we then need to understand and go through an evaluation looking at and to optimize the data collection architecture. So again, looking at each of the platforms, what are the data requirements of those different tools in order to drive those initiatives and drive those, just the functionality that we're expecting from that tool. We can define that for each tag on our website. We can combine that information together to really define what that architecture looks like. As mentioned, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here today. Next Wednesday, we'll be going through that entire process specifically around the data architecture in depth for a full hour next week. So join us next week on that webinar to really get into the nitty-gritty as it relates to the data architecture evaluation. Finally, when we're talking about auditing, we're talking about performance. So quantifying the impact and quantifying that performance impact of each platform loading across our different websites. We do this, again, leveraging functionality within Tag Inspector, where we are actually blocking or simulating the removal of tags running across our website, and then doing a statistical analysis of what does the performance look like with that tag versus without that tag. Doing that, we're able to help organizations define what are the platforms that are having the most impact, the most amount of time, or at the highest frequencies. So that one, you can see are tags impacting user experience at all. And then of those cases where they are, what are the platforms and what are the tags that are most contributing to that hindrance of experience. So quantifying those things, doing that analysis from that performance perspective is also very important. So all of those different action items, first understanding what are the platforms loading, doing that business evaluation of the tools and of the tags that you're leveraging across your websites, and then going through and answering those questions and doing that analysis for each of those components of tag governance, compliance and privacy, make sure that you're collecting compliant data, data collection architecture, making sure that you're collecting complete data, and then performance, making sure that all those activities and that data collection is happening in the most efficient way possible. Going through those evaluations is step one to get you the information necessary to then move forward, take necessary actions around implementation, take necessary actions around compliance considerations, as well as the cleanup and overall architecture and implementation of those tags on your website. So with that, quick summary, we went through the 6 Ps, really focusing on the people, platforms, and processes that are necessary for tag governance. Did a high-level review. As mentioned, we have a lot of more in-depth information on each of those topics in past webinars and other resources on the website. Really connected that to those different components within tag governance, and then went through what are those action steps and some practical recommendations for at least that first step to take in order to be able to really refine and build out your governance program. So with that, looks like we just have 2 minutes remaining. I'll hop over into a couple of questions. For any of these that I do not get to, we'll follow up with you personally following the webinar. So thank you very much for submitting these. First question here being a small team with limited roles, what would you say are the 3 most important roles to have in a cross-functional team? This related to the people, obviously, section there. Depends on the organization, honestly. So if your organization is large enough and is operating within areas where those compliance and regulatory requirements do in fact apply, I would say that legal and privacy is extremely important there. Outside of that though, kind of generally for all organizations, I would say the analytics piece, as well as just that marketing and the business piece are the 2 most critical. I mean, without understanding, analytics is going to drive and define a lot of the data collection activities and what those requirements are. And then the business and the marketing piece is going to define that purpose and the overall strategic vision. So without an understanding of what are we trying to accomplish, and then without an understanding of what are the specific ways in which we're trying to accomplish that, we can't get very far with trying to understand how is this data being used, what data exactly is being collected, which is really critical for those 2 components for privacy and compliance, as well as for that data collection architecture. And with that, we are at time. Again, I'll follow up, or marketing folks will follow up on any of these additional questions. Thank you all very, very much for your time. As always, we will send out this recording, and I hope to see you next week as we dig into some of these topics in much more granularity. Thank you all very much.